I'll give you $1 million if you walk out that door and never say my daughter's name again. Stephen laughed, the sound echoing hollowly against the floor-to-ceiling glass of his penthouse office. Behind him, the city lights of the empire he'd built shimmered like a trophy. Gyeong-cheol didn't flinch. He sat deep in the leather chair, plucking a single $100 bill from the overflowing briefcase as if it were a piece of junk mail. Outside the office, the muffled sounds of the gala continued. The elite laughing and clinking crystal, oblivious to the transaction happening behind closed doors. Gyeong-cheol's mind didn't race with the possibilities of the cash. It raced with the memory of Maria's laugh, a sound Stephen had clearly forgotten how to value. He looked at the billionaire, the tailored suit, the silver hair, the respectable philanthropy, and saw only the bulge of a man who traded souls for tax breaks. The silence was shattered not by a refusal, but by a gasp from the doorway. Maria stood there, her hands trembling as she clutched the very stacks of cash Stephen had told her were for charity. Her eyes fixed on the father who had just put a price tag on her heart. The heavy leather briefcase hit the mahogany desk with a dull, sickening thud. The sound of a man who believed every soul in the city had a clearance price. Stephen Bartow didn't lean forward. He didn't need to. He simply flipped the brass latches, letting the lid pop open to reveal tight, rhythmic rows of $100 bills. "There is exactly $1 million in there, Gyeong-cheol," Stephen said, his voice as polished and cold as the marble floors beneath them. "Consider it a relocation fee. Take it, leave the city, and never speak to my daughter again. From a man of my standing to a man of yours. Consider it a professional courtesy." The billionaire leaned back, a smug, expectant thinness to his lips. He was used to seeing men's eyes dilate at this much cash. He expected greed, or perhaps a flicker of fear. Instead, Gyeong-cheol remained unervingly still. The Mafia boss sat in the high-backed leather chair, his tailored blue suit sharp enough to cut glass. He didn't look at the briefcase with desire. He looked at it with the weary boredom of a man watching a bad magician perform a tired trick. Slowly, Gyeong-cheol reached out. His fingers, calloused from a life Stephen only read about in police reports, plucked a single bill from the top of a stack. He held it up to the light of the setting sun filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, examining the watermark with mock intensity. Then he laughed. It wasn't a roar of anger or a cinematic cackle. It was a soft, dry chuckle that vibrated with genuine pity. He flicked the bill back toward the briefcase, watching it flutter uselessly onto the pile. "You've spent so much time looking down from this tower, Stephen, that you've forgotten how the world actually works," Gyeong-cheol said, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. "You think you're buying my absence? You're just proving you don't know the value of what you're losing." Stephen's face flushed a deep, indignant red. "Don't play the philosopher with me. You're a thug. You take what isn't yours. I'm offering you a way to get rich without the risk of a cage." "The difference between us," Gyeong-cheol replied, leaning forward until his shadow eclipsed the money on the desk, "is that my people follow me because I keep my word. Your daughter loves me because I see her. You just see a line item on a balance sheet." He stood up, the movement fluid and predatory. He didn't spare the $1 million a second glance. "Keep your change, Stephen. You're going to need it for the legal fees." The heavy silence that followed Gyeong-cheol's rejection was punctured by a sharp, jagged intake of breath from the shadows of the hallway. Both men turned. Maria stood paralyzed in the doorway, her frame framed by the opulence of her father's private study. In her arms, she clutched a series of thick envelopes, the charity disbursements Stephen had asked her to organize for the gala. The irony of the moment hung in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. Her gaze dropped from her father's panicked face to the briefcase overflowing with cash, then to Gyeong-cheol, who stood like a pillar of salt amidst the wreckage of her world. "Maria," Stephen stammered, his calculated mask finally cracking. He moved to close the briefcase, his hands fumbling with the lid. "Sweetheart, this isn't what it looks like. We were just discussing your future, your security." "My security?" Maria's voice was a whisper, but it carried more weight than the $1,000,000 on the desk. She stepped into the room, her heels clicking rhythmically against the floor, a sound like a ticking clock. You told me Gyeong-cheol was the one who only cared about power. You told me he was the one who treated people like property. She stopped at the edge of the desk, looking down at the rows of Benjamins. She recognized the sequential numbering on the bands, the same markings as the trust fund donations she had been auditing for him all morning. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her father wasn't just trying to buy off her boyfriend. He was doing it with money he had claimed was for the city's poor, the illusion of the great Stephen Bartow. The benevolent patriarch and pillar of the community didn't just fade, it disintegrated. You didn't offer this because you're worried about me, she said, finally looking her father in the eye. You offered it because you're terrified of him, because you can't control him and you can't control me. Gyeong-cheol moved then, not toward the money, but toward her. He didn't reach out to touch her. He simply stood as a silent witness, his presence a stark contrast to Stephen's frantic maneuvering. Maria, listen to reason, Stephen pleaded, his voice rising in a desperate attempt to reclaim authority. He is a criminal. I am trying to save you from a life of violence. The only violence I see here is what you're doing to this family, Maria replied. She turned her back on the desk and the $1,000,000 bribe, her decision made in the space between heartbeats. She looked at Gyeong-cheol, seeing the man for the first time without her father's poisonous narration. Let's go. As they walked out, leaving Stephen alone with his stacks of useless paper, the rich dad realized that in trying to buy his daughter's future, he had officially declared bankruptcy on her heart. The elevator ride down from the penthouse was a tomb of silence, the digital floor counter the only thing moving in the mirrored cage. When the doors slid open, Maria didn't head for the gala. She headed for the rain-slicked pavement of the street. Stephen scrambled after her, his composure discarded somewhere near the 50th floor. Maria, stop. You are being emotional, not rational, Stephen called out, catching her arm near the fountain. He ignored the confused glances from the arriving socialites. That man is a predator. I was simply using the only language he understands. I was protecting you from a life in the dirt. Maria spun around, shaking his hand off. Protection? You held an auction for my life, Dad. You didn't even haggle. I was testing him. Stephen's voice dropped to a hiss, his eyes darting around to ensure no press were within earshot. And he failed the moment he stepped into my office. Men like that don't love, Maria. They occupy. I was providing an exit strategy before he drags you down into the blood and the mud of his world. Everything I have built, this legacy, your name, it's all for you. What is $1,000,000 compared to your soul? My soul was never the one for sale, she whispered, her voice trembling with a cold, final clarity. She turned toward Gyeong-cheol's black sedan idling at the curb. Yours was, and I think you just spent the last of it. As the car pulled away, leaving Stephen standing under the golden glow of his own marquee, the atmosphere shifted. Inside the sedan, the dark romance of the city blurred past the windows. Gyeong-cheol didn't offer platitudes or comfort. He sat in the shadows of the back seat, his phone already glowing as he bypassed encrypted layers of the city's financial grid. They arrived at the docks 30 minutes later. The air here didn't smell like expensive cologne and filtered oxygen. It smelled of salt, diesel, and hard labor. This was Gyeong-cheol's cathedral. He stepped out of the car, his movements losing the guarded stillness of the office and taking on a lethal rhythmic efficiency. His lieutenants approached, their silhouettes cutting through the harbor mist. They expected an order for a hit, a retaliatory strike for the insult in the penthouse. But Gyeong-cheol's eyes were fixed on the digital ledger on his screen. He thinks I'm a thug who wants his cash, Gyeong-cheol said to his second-in-command, his voice echoing against the corrugated steel of the shipping containers. He thinks his money is clean because it's behind a desk. We're not going to burn his house down, Jin-ho. We're going to show the world the rot in the foundation. He looked back at Maria, who stood at the edge of the pier, watching the dark water. The war had begun, but it wouldn't be fought with bullets. It would be fought with the very currency Stephen Bartow worshipped. The warehouse office at the docks was a skeletal ribcage of steel and flickering monitors, a stark contrast to the velvet-lined tomb Yoon Gyeong-cheol had just escaped. He sat before a bank of screens, the single $100 bill he'd swiped from the briefcase lying on the desk like a forensic specimen. Beside him, Maria sat huddled in a borrowed wool coat, her eyes fixed on the rhythmic scrolling of bank codes and wire transfer logs. "My father is a lot of things," Maria said, her voice brittle as she watched his hackers peel back the layers of Bartow Industries. "But he's meticulous. He wouldn't just pull $1 million in cash from a personal account. The board would see the dip. The auditors would flag it. He didn't pull it from his accounts," Yoon Gyeong-cheol murmured, his eyes narrowing as a specific string of characters flashed red on the center monitor. He tapped a key, freezing the display. A digital paper trail bloomed across the screen, a complex web of shell companies and administrative adjustments. Yoon Gyeong-cheol traced the origin point with a steady finger. The money hadn't moved from a corporate slush fund or a hidden offshore account. It had been diverted from a domestic trust, one labeled M. Bartow, Educational and Future Security. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Maria leaned forward, her face turning a ghostly pale in the blue light of the monitor. "That's my fund. That was the money from my mother's estate. He told me it was locked until I turned 25. He didn't unlock it," Yoon Gyeong-cheol said, his voice dropping into a register of cold, lethal fury. "He embezzled it. He took your inheritance, laundered it through a series of fake charitable donations, and then tried to use your own dead mother's legacy to buy your silence. The betrayal was no longer just a paternal overreach. It was a financial desecration. Stephen Bartow hadn't offered his own wealth to save his daughter. He had stolen her future to pay for his control over her present." Maria stood up, her hands no longer trembling. The shock that had paralyzed her in the penthouse office had been replaced by something sharp and cauterized. She looked at the screen, at the cold numbers that proved her father viewed her not as a person, but as a resource to be liquidated. "He thinks he's playing a game of chess," she whispered, looking at Yoon Gyeong-cheol. "He's playing a game of shadows," Yoon Gyeong-cheol replied, his gaze returning to the $100 bill. "And he forgot that I've spent my entire life learning how to breathe in the dark." He reached for his phone, his face a mask of predatory calm. The bribe wasn't just an insult anymore. It was the first piece of evidence in a trial Stephen Bartow never saw coming. The following morning, the sun rose over the city like a tarnished coin, but inside the glass towers of the financial district, the air was already frantic. Stephen Bartow paced his office, waiting for the news that Yoon Gyeong-cheol had vanished into the night. Instead, his lead analyst burst through the doors, face ashen and clutching a tablet that showed the morning's opening trades. "Someone is bleeding us out, Stephen," the man choked out. "Small blocks of shares, just under the reporting threshold, are being vacuumed up by a dozen different offshore entities. It's coordinated, it's aggressive, and it's happening faster than our buyback algorithms can respond." Stephen felt a cold sweat prickle his neck. "Who? Is it the Vanguard Group? The Suttons?" "No," the analyst whispered. "The capital is coming from shell companies registered to the dockyards. It's gray money, Stephen. Millions of it." Miles away, in the dim light of a waterfront warehouse, Yoon Gyeong-cheol sat behind a laptop, the glow of the stock ticker reflecting in his dark eyes. Beside him, Maria watched the digital slaughter with a grim, focused intensity. This wasn't the dirty violence her father had warned her about. There were no guns, no shattered glass, just the steady, rhythmic pulse of a predator claiming territory. "My father's board of directors is loyal only to the highest bidder," Maria said, her voice devoid of the warmth it once held for the man in the penthouse. "If you control enough of the minority, they'll turn on him the second the stock dips." "I don't need to control the board yet," Yoon Gyeong-cheol replied, his fingers dancing across the keys as he authorized another massive wire transfer. "I just need to sit in the shadow they've spent 30 years ignoring. Your father thinks my wealth is buried in holes in the ground. He doesn't realize that in this city, the shadows go all the way to the top. He wasn't just buying shares, he was buying leverage. Every cent he moved was a silent strike against the man who had tried to put a price on Maria's heart. While Stephen's empire was built on a foundation of stolen trust and clean lies, Gyeong-cheol's counteroffensive was fueled by the brutal honesty of the streets. By noon, the Bartow industry stock began to shudder. To the public, it looked like market volatility. To Stephen, it felt like a ghost had walked into his boardroom and sat at the head of the table. Gyeong-cheol looked at Maria, a rare, sharp smile touching his lips. The best part about being a monster, Maria, is that I don't have to follow the rules of the men who wear suits. He wanted me to leave the city. Instead, I think I'll buy his office. Stephen Bartow was not a man who accepted defeat. He was a man who reconfigured the board. As the ticker for Bartow Industries continued its jagged descent, Stephen stood in the center of his office, his phone pressed to his ear with white-knuckled intensity. He had long ago learned that if you couldn't buy a man, you buried him. "The shipment is in place?" Stephen asked, his voice a jagged rasp. "Warehouse 7. South Docks." The voice on the other end replied. A man on the payroll of the city's narcotics division. 200 kilos of uncut product, hidden behind a false wall of Gyeong-cheol's own imported textiles. The tip-off goes to the feds in 20 minutes. By midnight, your Mafia problem will be in a federal holding cell. Stephen hung up, a slow, toxic calm returning to his chest. He smoothed his tie in the reflection of the window. He would frame it as a tragedy to Maria, the inevitable fall of the criminal she had foolishly chosen. He would be the grieving father who tried to save her, the man who was right all along. Down at the docks, the air grew heavy with the scent of ozone and impending rain. Gyeong-cheol stood on the balcony of his warehouse, his eyes scanning the perimeter. He felt the shift in the atmosphere before he saw it. The harbor was too quiet. The usual rhythmic clatter of the night shift had been replaced by a suffocating stillness. "Gyeong-cheol," Maria whispered, stepping out behind him. She held a tablet showing a sudden surge in encrypted police frequencies. "The scanners are lighting up. They're moving in on Warehouse 7. They're calling it a major interdiction based on a high-level anonymous source." Gyeong-cheol didn't panic. He watched the far end of the pier, where the faint blue and red glow of silent sirens began to flicker against the fog. He knew exactly what was in Warehouse 7. He also knew that Stephen Bartow was a man of patterns. Stephen believed in the absolute power of optics, that if he made someone look like a monster, the world would treat them as one. "He's using the old playbook," Gyeong-cheol said, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "Plant the rot, call the guards, and play the hero." "We have to move," Maria said, her hand reaching for his arm. "If they find that shipment on your property, they'll find exactly what your father paid for," Gyeong-cheol interrupted, turning to her with a look of predatory clarity. "But they won't find it where he expects. He thinks he's framing a criminal. He's actually just providing me with the final piece of his own coffin." He tapped a command into his phone, signaling his men to initiate the pivot. The sirens were getting closer, the scream of tires echoing off the corrugated steel. Stephen had finally drawn blood, but he had forgotten one fundamental rule of the shadows. Never corner a man who knows the layout of the maze better than you do. The roar of the tactical units echoed across the pier, but inside the labyrinth of shipping containers, Maria was moving with a cold, frantic precision she hadn't known she possessed. The rain had finally broken, a relentless deluge that turned the docks into a blur of ink and steel. She led Gyeong-cheol through a service tunnel her father's maps didn't show, a passage used by the men who actually moved the city's pulse, far beneath the notice of billionaires. "Through here," she whispered, her lungs burning with the damp salt air. She swiped a stolen keycard, a remnant from her time as the perfect intern at Bartow Industries, and a heavy iron door groaned open. They emerged into a nondescript parking garage blocks away from the police perimeter. A battered, silver sedan sat idling in the corner. Maria had arranged it through a contact she'd met only hours ago, one of Gyeong-cheol's lieutenants who looked at her not with suspicion, but with a newfound, grim respect. Gyeong-cheol paused at the car door, his suit ruined by the rain, the blood from a grazed knuckle staining his white cuff. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the smudge of grease on her cheek and the fierce, protective light in her eyes. "If you drive away with me now, Maria, there is no going back. Your father will make sure you are dead to the world he built. You'll be the accomplice to a ghost." "That world was a lie," Maria said, her voice steady even as the sirens wailed in the distance. "My father treats people like assets and love like a liability. He thinks he's the hero because he wears a tie, but you're the only one who didn't try to buy me tonight." She stepped closer, the neon light of a nearby sign casting her shadow against his. "He calls you a monster. Maybe you are. But I've lived with a saint my whole life, and I'm done with the way they bleed you dry. I'd rather be in the dark with you than in a gilded cage with him." Gyeong-cheol reached out, his hand cupping her face with a tenderness that defied his reputation. The Mafia boss and the billionaire's daughter were gone. There were only two people standing in the rain, choosing a side in a war that had finally become personal. "Then we go to ground," he murmured. "He wants to play with blood and ink? We'll let him write the first chapter. But I'm going to write the ending." They slid into the car, disappearing into the city's gray arteries just as the first federal agents breached the empty warehouse. Stephen Bartow had won the battle of optics, but he had lost the only thing that made his empire worth ruling. As the sedan merged into the midnight traffic, Maria didn't look back. She was no longer a witness. She was the architect of her father's ruin. The safe house was a windowless basement beneath a shuttered textile factory, smelling of old paper and ozone. While the world above watched the news cycle feast on the discovery of the drug shipment at the docks, Gyeong-cheol's inner circle was performing a different kind of surgery. Maria sat at a long metal table, surrounded by three of Gyeong-cheol's most trusted assets. Two forensic accountants who had spent years hiding money and a hacker whose screen was a blur of cascading green code. They weren't looking for drugs or guns. They were following the ghost of $1 million. "There," the hacker muttered, tapping a key that sent a complex flow chart onto the main monitor. "The bribe money your father offered Gyeong-cheol. It didn't just vanish from your trust fund, Maria. It was the final out, in a massive circular flow." Gyeong-cheol stood in the shadows behind them, his gaze fixed on the screen. "Show her the scale." The accountant pointed to a series of offshore entities: Bartow Heritage, Blue Horizon Philanthropy, and the Maria Foundation. "It's a classic carousel scheme. Your father has been over-reporting charitable losses for a decade. He moves dirty corporate revenue into your trust, claims it as a tax-exempt donation, and then pulls it back out as operational expenses or, in this case, a private bribe. He isn't just a thief, Maria. He's the architect of a billion-dollar tax evasion ring. That $1 million he tried to hand over? It was the loose thread that pulls the whole sweater apart." Maria stared at the numbers. Every gala she had attended, every ribbon she had cut for a new hospital wing, had been a front for her father to scrub his ledger clean. The respectability of the Bartow name was built on a foundation of systemic fraud. "He's been using the city's infrastructure to hide his debt," Gyeong-cheol said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "If the IRS or the SEC saw this bridge between his personal trust and the corporate holdings, the Bartow empire wouldn't just fall. It would be liquidated by the state. He thinks he's safe because he owns the local police," Maria said, her eyes hardening as she looked at the evidence. "He thinks the frame-up at the docks bought him time." "He bought himself a rope," Gyeong-cheol replied. He leaned over the table, his hand resting near Maria's. "We don't need to fight the police he's bought. We just need to send this to the people he can't buy. The men in Washington who don't care about his name, only his math." The audit was complete. The Mafia boss had found the one thing the billionaire couldn't survive: the truth of his own books. The grand ballroom of the Bartow Plaza was a sea of silk, gold, and forced laughter. Crystal chandeliers cast a deceptive glow over the city's elite, who had gathered to celebrate Stephen Bartow's 60th year of unmatched integrity. Stephen stood at the center of the dais, a glass of vintage champagne in hand, his face a mask of triumphant relief. To the world, He was the grieving father who had successfully purged a criminal element from his daughter's life. To himself, he was invincible. The heavy double doors at the back of the hall didn't just open. They were surrendered. The music faltered, then died in a discordant scrape of violins. Every head turned as Yoon Gyeong-cheol stepped into the light. He wasn't wearing the tactical gear of a fugitive or the rough leather of the docks. He wore a midnight black tuxedo that made him look like the most dangerous man in the room, because he didn't come with guns. He came with a single, familiar object, the mahogany-latched briefcase. The crowd parted like a retreating tide as Gyeong-cheol walked toward the dais with the measured, predatory grace of a king entering a conquered city. Stephen's glass shattered against the marble floor, the champagne spraying his polished shoes like a final, desperate anointing. "You're supposed to be in a cell," Stephen hissed, his voice cracking as the flashbulbs of the society press began to fire in a frantic, blinding rhythm. "You overpaid the police, Stephen," Gyeong-cheol said, his voice carrying through the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. "But you underpaid your accountants." Gyeong-cheol reached the dais and set the briefcase on the podium, right next to Stephen's Lifetime Achievement Award. With a sharp click-clack, he flipped the latches. The lid fell back, revealing the stacks of cash. "You offered me this a few nights ago to buy your daughter's silence," Gyeong-cheol said, pitching his voice for the microphones. "But I found something interesting when I looked at the bills. It turns out this $1 million belongs to the people of this city, specifically the tax office and your daughter's stolen trust. I'm just a man of honor returning lost property." A murmur of confusion and dawning horror rippled through the guests. Stephen's face transitioned from a pale ghost to a livid purple. "Security! Get this man out of here. He's a wanted felon. The only felons in this room are the ones whose names are on the federal warrants being filed at this very second," Gyeong-cheol replied, leaning in until he was inches from Stephen's ear. "Maria sends her regards. She's currently sitting with the SEC, explaining exactly how you laundered this gift through her mother's name." Gyeong-cheol turned his back on the billionaire, leaving the briefcase open like a gaping wound for the cameras to feast upon. As he walked out of the gala, the flashes didn't stop, but they were no longer capturing a celebration. They were documenting an execution. The fall of the Bartow dynasty was not a slow decay. It was a sudden, violent collapse of a house built on sand. Within weeks, the mahogany desk was cleared, the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse office overlooking a city that no longer feared the name Stephen M. Bartow. Forced into a shameful early retirement and buried under a mountain of federal litigation, the rich dad was left with nothing but the echo of his own hubris in an empty mansion. But the city did not stop breathing. It simply changed its rhythm. High above the South Docks, in a refurbished industrial loft that combined the sleek lines of corporate power with the raw honesty of the streets, Maria stood looking out at the skyline. She no longer wore the gilded cage, silks her father had chosen for her. She was dressed in sharp, understated black, the tablet in her hand glowing with the first quarter projections for the Bartow Gyeong Foundation. "The board tried to fight the restructuring," Maria said as the door opened behind her. "They thought they could keep the old shell companies alive. They didn't realize I'd already signed the assets over to the Community Redevelopment Trust." Gyeong-cheol walked to her side, his presence a grounded shadow against the twilight. He wasn't the monster her father had painted, nor was he the hero of a sanitized fairy tale. He was a man who understood that power, like water, was only as clean as the pipes it flowed through. "They're used to men who buy loyalty," Gyeong-cheol said, resting a hand on the small of her back. "They don't know what to do with a family that builds it." Together, they had redefined the term powerful family. They didn't rule through the silent violence of embezzlement or the loud violence of the streets. Instead, they used the reclaimed Bartow millions to fund the very neighborhood Stephen had exploited. The Mafia boss provided the protection and the ironclad logistics. The billionaire's daughter provided the vision and the moral compass. The city watched as the dark romance of their union became the most formidable alliance in its history. It was a new empire, one where integrity was the primary currency and honor was the only law. As the lights of the city flickered on, reflecting in the dark water of the harbor, Maria finally felt the weight of her father's shadow lift. She wasn't an asset to be traded or a legacy to be protected. She was the architect of a new world, standing beside the only man who had ever known her true value. The briefcase was closed. The debt was paid. And for the first time in the history of the city, the power belonged to those who weren't afraid to walk in the dark to find the light. Here are some lessons to learn from the story. The story of Stephen Bartow and Yoon Gyeong-cheol serves as a modern parable on the true nature of integrity, stripping away the veneers of social class to reveal the character beneath. The primary moral is that respectability is not synonymous with morality. Stephen wore the clean uniform of a billionaire philanthropist, yet his heart was governed by the same transactional ruthlessness he projected onto others. Conversely, Gyeong-cheol, labeled a monster by polite society, operated with a rigid code of honor that wealth could not corrupt. It reminds us that a suit can hide a thief, just as a shadow can house a protector. Furthermore, the narrative highlights that control is the antithesis of love. Stephen viewed his daughter as an asset to be managed and her affection as something to be brokered. By attempting to buy her future with her own stolen legacy, he proved that greed eventually consumes even the most sacred bonds. Ultimately, the story teaches that power is only as dirty as the hand that wields it. Influence can be used to build gilded cages or to fund community resurrection. The difference lies in whether one seeks to rule over people or to stand beside them.